Germany had always been a land power, but Kaiser Wilhelm II had a passion for building up his navy, which grew out of his inferiority complex with his British relations. This competition got so expensive that in 1909 the Royal Navy decided to give up its traditional two-power standard and instead decided to concentrate on maintaining a fleet that was 60% larger than the growing German fleet. To do this, they fought in alliance with their old enemies, the French. This took the form of the Anglo-French Naval Agreement of 1912. Under this agreement, the French took over the main burden of defending the Mediterranean, while the Royal Navy undertook to protect the North Sea. In Germany, Admiral Tirpitz had already recognised the danger of blockade, and decided the best form of defence would be to go on the offensive. He saw no point in hoping that the enemy fleet would come to him, while his rotted in port. The offensive power of submarines, mines and torpedoes meant that the Royal Navy kept most of its most powerful and most expensive ships safely tucked away in Scapa Flow. The blockade was patrolled by smaller and cheaper cruisers and destroyers. One of these was the minesweeper HMS Halcyon. On the 3rd of November 1914, she was making her way north-east through calm waters towards the Cross Sand light vessel. She was supported by two destroyers, Lively and Leopard. Through the mist, they saw the outline of a four-funnel cruiser appear. They flashed a challenge with their signal lamp. The response was the flash of gunfire, and shells started landing near them. The day before, Rear Admiral Hipper had slipped out of the Jade on board the battlecruiser Seydlitz. He had with him Moltke and von der Tann, as well as the large armoured cruiser Blucher. This powerful flotilla was screened by light cruisers and destroyers of the 2nd Scouting Group. Hipper called back to his light cruisers, leaving it up to the great guns of the battle cruisers to destroy Little Halcyon. The shells splashes of the light cruiser guns were replaced by towering waterspouts created by 11-inch shells. The British ship disappeared behind a curtain of water thrown up by the shells landing around her. One shot blew away their yardarm, another damaged the wireless. Shell fragments cut the compass clean in half and wounded the man at the helm. At 7:40, Hipper realised that he was wasting his time using an elephant gun to swap her to fly, and called off the pursuit before his force was led into an area that he knew had been mined. The German battle cruisers had fired over 300 12-inch shells at Little Halcyon and the two destroyers. It was a miracle that they had not been sunk. Drenched but lucky, Halcyon slipped away in the chaos. By 8:30 she had reached the nearby port of Yarmouth and sent a report to the Admiralty that there were battle cruisers just 12 miles off Lowestoft. Hipper would not have been worried about this report. In fact, he was counting on it. The German plan was that the battlecruiser raid would draw units of the Grand Fleet south across a line of U-boats and onto German-laid minefields. If Little Halcyon's report was not enough to provoke a response, then he was sure what he was going to do next would. He ordered the German battlecruisers to fire at Yarmouth. The town lay defenceless before their gun sights. Before the war, there had been a 6-inch gun battery manned by territorial soldiers, but these had been sent to France, along with the rest of the British Army. None of the shells reached the port, so the German bombardment only churned up sand and water. This was enough for the Admiralty, and it came to life, ordering Admiral Beatty to steam south with his own battlecruisers. But by the time that they got there, the sea was empty. Hipper had decided he could not wait for them. He left the coast of England behind him and returned to Germany, that night in thick fog. As they were approaching Wilhelmshaven, one of the German cruisers realised that it had left the safe channel and was sailing straight into one of Germany's own defensive minefields. She made a hard turn, only for the current to pull her broadside onto the mines. Within minutes, she had capsized and sunk. The German force only managed to lay its own minefield off England, which would later sink the British submarine D5 and 3 fishing trawlers. But overall, the High Seas Fleet's first major surface offensive had not gone as well as they had hoped. The Kaiser awarded Hipper the Iron Cross for his part in the raid, but he refused to pin it on. "I won't wear it," he declared, "until I've done something." In London, Admiral Fisher had a hunch that this was a precursor of things to come. He was right. The First Sea Lord, Arthur Balfour, sent an open letter to the mayors of Lowestoft and Yarmouth, saying that he would redistribute forces to make raids more dangerous for the Germans. It would only be a month before Balfour's promises were put to the test. On Wednesday, December the 16th, 1914, Alfred Beale was on his daily walk delivering the post in the holiday resort of Scarborough. Margaret Griggs, a maidservant, had just opened the door to take some letters when a shell burst by the side of the house. They were both killed instantly. More shells whistled overhead when they disappeared into boiling columns of dirt and smoke. The sound of the explosions soon mixed with collapsing roofs and shattered glass. William Tunmore, a 61-year-old railway worker, was trying to calm his horse, who had been frightened by the thunder of explosions when a shell burst nearby had killed him. A member of the town council was dressing in his bedroom when a shell broke his leg and arm and pierced his chest. He died on his way to hospital. Another shell fragment hit a man a few yards away from a small boy who'd been making an early morning round with his milk cart. He was killed outright. 18 people were killed and 200 more wounded, and 200 houses damaged or destroyed. The smoke could be seen for miles. Some people thought that the whole of Scarborough was in flames, but the fires were soon extinguished. Shells hit St Mary's Church, where the younger sister of Charlotte and Emily Bronte, Anne Bronte, was buried. They also hit nearby St Martin's Church. Here, an archdeacon was celebrating communion. He paused to tell his congregation that they were safe there as they could be anywhere, and then he carried on with his service. 10 minutes after the bombardment began, it stopped. The washers departed, leaving the dead behind. As the smoke cleared, the streets filled with stunned people, and the local Boy Scout troop formed an improvised ambulance service to carry the injured to hospital. They would not be the only ones suffering that day. At 7:55 a.m, 4 British destroyers were patrolling off Hartlepool. A little further to the west, they saw something coming out of the mist, and then sent a recognition signal. The Germans replied with a storm of 11 and 5.9-inch shells. The bombardment of Hartlepool itself began at 8:10. Scarborough had been an underfunded tourist resort, but Hartlepool had a way of firing back. This was a small battery of guns, a detachment of the Durham Light Infantry. These soldiers had been up since 4:30 in the morning, waiting for the Germans. They had each been given 250 rounds of ammunition for their rifles, and a mug of tea. When the artillerymen first saw the ships, they seemed so large and powerful, and so close, that they did not think they could be anything other than British. Then they opened fire. Over 1,000 shells screamed into Hartlepool. A British light cruiser was sheltering in the harbour. Her captain tried to get her out to sea, as the water around them boiled with shell bursts. Shells slammed into his ships, killing 4 men and wounding 7 others. He tried to make a dash for it, but the German shells forced him to steer his ship aground and hope that she could be salvaged later. The gun near the lighthouse engaged the smallest of the 3 ships in the German line. When the Germans replied, they were only saved from annihilation by the fact that the German ships had been firing at such short range that the delayed action fuses in their shells could not have time to trigger. The town itself was not so lucky. 7-year-old Sarah Wilkinson had been eager to go to school that morning, hoping to get a good attendance medal. She never reached it. She was blown to pieces on Crimson Street. Another shell smashed into a house and killed her father, mother, and their 6 children. A family named Dixon was running down the street when a shell burst over them. 14-year-old George, 8-year-old Margaret, and 7-year-old Albert died, leaving their mother covered in their blood. Her one remaining child, a baby named John, lay unhurt in her arms. In total, 86 civilians were killed. Whitby was next. At 9 o'clock in the morning, 2 warships approached from the south, about a mile from the shore, and then they opened fire. Frederick Randall, a 30-year-old Coast Guard boatsman, had been on his way to work when he was decapitated by a shell splinter. The German Navy was branded baby killers because of this raid. The German newspapers replied that the towns had been fortified, although this was clearly not true in the case of Whitby and the resort town of Scarborough. Of the 3, only Hartlepool had any defences, and they had managed to land 4 direct hits on Blucher killing or wounding 9 German sailors before the ship had headed back out to sea at 8:50. These raids came as a shock to the British public, as it was the first time since 1667 that an enemy fleet had been able to get past the Royal Navy and raid Britain itself. Winston Churchill, then the First Lord of the Admiralty, was having a bath when he heard the news. He jumped up and splashed off to get dressed. Unlike the British public, he was not shocked. In fact, he had been expecting it, because the Germans had fallen into a British trap. Early in the morning on the day of the raid, officers of the British battlecruiser squadron had been woken by the rattling of torpedo nets being brought in as their squadron got ready to sail. They left Scapa Flow a few hours after Hipper had left the Jade. Flotilla commanders all along the east coast had been told that the German battlecruiser squadron was coming out. Trewitt at Harwich had been instructed to have his light cruisers and destroyers underway before dawn. Keyes was ordered to dispatch 8 submarines to guard the English Channel. Beatty's battlecruisers hurtled south at 26 knots to catch Hipper before he could escape. They were sailing into the teeth of a gale in complete darkness. They even turned off their navigation lights and covered every scuttle so as not to let a chink of light be seen anywhere. Up on the bridge, each of the navigating officers, the great steel leviathans, had to strain to make out the outlines of the ship they were following a mere 400 yards ahead as waves surged across their bows. The weather had been so bad that they had had to leave their destroyer escorts behind. 2 light cruisers were damaged by the waves that they had to return to base for repair, and HMS Boadicea lost several men overboard. Even the mighty HMS Lion rolled and pitched as she drove through the heavy seas towards a rendezvous point 25 miles south-east of the Dogger Bank. Down in the fore transmitting station, where firing solutions would be calculated, they waited with anxious expectation. The Admiral had even paid one of his rare visits to the wardroom, now stripped of much of its wooden decoration as the ship prepared for battle. They had known that Hippo would mount a raid, but they did not know where. It could be anywhere along the 300 miles of coast. Rather than trying to guess where they'd be going, Jellicoe had decided that he would catch them as they returned home. As soon as they received signal that Scarborough was being shelled, Sir George Warner sent out a signal, "Scarborough being shelled. I am proceeding towards Hull." Beatty replied, "Are you? I am going towards Scarborough." They now knew where the German fleet was, which meant they knew his route back. There was only a narrow strip in the minefields that had been laid down the east coast of England, and they were going to have to use it to get back into the North Sea. At 9:30 in the morning, Hipper turned towards this gap. He had no idea that there were British battlecruisers waiting for him, but he did know there were British warships around. Before dawn that morning, HMS Lynx had been spotted a strange destroyer 500 yards off her port bow. They sped eastwards. Lynx and her 4 companions gave chase. This destroyer was part of the advanced screen of the High Seas Fleet. The German cruiser Hamburg spotted HMS Hardy and opened fire. Within 6 minutes, Hardy's steering gear was disabled and the ship was on fire. Lynx too was put out of action. Command of the destroyers now passed to Loftus Jones on HMS Shark, who would gain fame at the Battle of Jutland. He turned southeast and found the cruiser Rhone and 5 destroyers. He chased them eastward, hoping to get into position to launch his torpedoes. But when he met up with the cruisers Stuttgart and Hamburg, there was nothing he could do but turn west away from the Germans. He tried to use his wireless to report what he'd found, despite the Germans using their powerful telephone sets to drown out the airwaves. Admiral Ingenhol was convinced that the British destroyers were part of the mass flotillas that would be screening the Grand Fleet, flotillas which were actually still at Scapa Flow and unable to move because of the weather. At 5:30, he ordered his squadron to turn southeast. Tirpitz would be furious and Hipper would be on his own when he met the British fleet. SMS Stralsund was steaming through the gap in the minefields when they spotted HMS Southampton streaming straight towards them. It was just then that the weather turned for the worst. A rain squall drove down from the northwest, whipping the sea up into white foam, with only the occasional flash of gunfire lighting up the murk. The Germans radioed back to Hipper, who was coming up the channel 50 miles behind them, that they were being chased. Hipper altered his course slightly towards Stralsund, not knowing that Admiral Beatty was less than 30 miles away. At 11:50, that Beatty's flag lieutenant, Ralph Seymour, made a mistake that changed the course of the action. HMS Falmouth and HMS Nottingham left their positions to try and go to Southampton's aid. Beatty wanted to order them back. Seymour and his men flashed a searchlight to signal that the light cruisers should resume station, but he did not specify which light cruisers. The message was passed along to Commodore Goodenough, who read it and assumed that he was being recalled from his unequal combat so as not to hamper the battle cruisers from engaging the enemy. Goodenough felt that he must obey, and with enormous reluctance he broke off the battle. He turned his ships back towards Lyon. When he reached the giant battle cruiser, he received another signal from Beatty. "What have you done with enemy light cruiser?" Goodenough replied, "They disappeared, steering south when I received your signal to resume station." Beatty ordered him to resume the fight, but by this time Stralsund had already escaped. Although it might have felt like that on board the German ship, as the next thing they saw was the outline of the giant British battleship King George V. The captain of the Stralsund had his men flash the same recognition signal that Goodenough had flashed to him earlier. The deception gave him just enough time to turn and run, pursued by 4 British armoured cruisers. The German ship was faster and managed to lose them in a rain cloud. At 4:30, Beatty made a fateful and wrong decision. He abandoned his westward course and swung his ships around. He wanted to try and put his ships between Hipper and Germany. What he didn't know was that Hipper was heading straight towards him. If he had held his course, a battle between them would have begun at around 1 o'clock. Instead, the battle cruisers raced east at full speed, away from the German squadron. They never even caught sight of the German battlecruisers, who escaped around the northern flank of the British squadrons. The British kept up their search all day, until at 3:47, when Beatty told them to relinquish the chase. They were joined by Admiral Jellicoe's armada. The Grand Fleet had not originally been part of the plan. They had been sent out at the last minute in case Beatty had encountered something that his ships could not deal with. But by the time Hipper's ships were already home. Jellicoe was informed by wireless, and he had spent the rest of the day in battle exercises and target practice. Back at the Admiralty, Admiral Fisher was furious. Their signals intelligence had been perfect, and they had wasted it. Beatty was furious with Goodenough for letting the Germans go once he had engaged them, and the public was furious at all of them for allowing British seaside towns to be bombarded by the enemy. Changes needed to be made, so the battlecruisers were moved from their base at Scapa Flow to Rosyth so they could provide a reassurance by being visibly closer to the northeastern towns. But there were still more disasters to come, as Hipper was not the only raider lurking in the North Sea. Next time, I'm going to be talking about the live bait squadron and the young midshipman who was sunk 3 times in 1 day. If that sounds interesting, please like and subscribe to tell the algorithm that you'd like to see it, and to everyone else, thank you for listening this long.